My name is Rachel Tyler. According to everyone I'm in day-to-day contact with, that's who I am. But I was born Robert Tyler. Robert now seems more like a ghost to me than a prior version of myself. He no longer exists. Rachel subsumed him nearly 2 years ago when she introduced herself to the world. Back then, I was a virgin. I was 30 years old and in charge of a company that I had built from the ground up. After I moved away from my parents and everyone I knew to start a new life for myself, I briefly held a decent-paying job. I saved every dollar I could to start a business. At first, I was just selling garbage on the internet, but somehow that turned into profits for me. Then I started to invest those proceeds in the stock market. The market took off, and I was sitting pretty. It didn't take me long before I had a little corporation called Lawnmower Industries going in the nice little town of Lawnmower. I had a salesman and a secretary named Kathy down at the small office that I rented. The salesman left for better opportunities, and I replaced him with 2 young girls fresh out of college named Angela and Catherine. They were better looking than my old salesman was and were competent at their jobs. That was all that was needed of them. Most of the company's money came from investing some of the corporation's profits, but the corporation's operational revenue was in the black too. Robert Tyler had been something of a ghost at the company to outsiders from the beginning. I never dealt with clients in person or by phone. That was what I had the saleswomen for. They dealt with clients and they made pitches for new ones. I just oversaw their work. I even rented the office through a realty agent who I only dealt with once. Literally, only that one person and my employees ever dealt with Robert Tyler in his corporate capacity. It was all for the best, since Robert wasn't long for this world. I remember the day it all changed. I went to work that day dressed in my normal pinstriped businessman's suit with sheer black pantyhose underneath. I had worn tights or pantyhose under my suits hundreds of times before without incident. I was always careful not to show my legs. I wasn't in a relationship, so no one ever saw my hairless legs. I made sure to wax frequently. I had kept my whole body hairless from my neck down since I moved out of my parents' home and moved to the other side of the country. I kept my body soft and as feminine as I could. The pantyhose over my legs helped make me happy. I loved to be a little feminine in public since I couldn't be completely so because it was deemed unacceptable by society. At home, it was a different story. I spent most of my time at home in women's clothes and shoes. I played out my fantasies working for a fictional boss as a secretary in my home office. I loved to parade around in heels and skirt suits. The day was like any other at the office. I examined the work of my 2 saleswomen. The work was typically satisfactory. They were competent saleswomen. They did enough to satisfy me, but they always seemed to have more talent than they used. They were both young and underachievers, but I wasn't a taskmaster. They did enough to help make the corporation highly profitable in addition to my investments that had panned out. I walked out of my executive office and into the larger office. I looked at my secretary, Kathy, as she was typing away. She looked up at me as my office door closed behind me. I took a step and felt my pant leg get caught by the door, but I kept moving forward. As I tried to stop myself, I felt the snag and then the tear. Kathy glanced at my pant leg and then looked more intently as she saw my pantyhose. She put her hand over her mouth. I was sure she was about to bust out laughing, but she gave me a serious look. I thought it was mild shock, but now I think she saw this as her opportunity to advance. Catherine and Angela noticed Kathy's surprised look in my red face and came over from their desks. Angela giggled while Catherine tried to stop her. However, the girls in their mid-20s found that such efforts were difficult and in vain. They both started to giggle at their employer's expense. Kathy put a stop to what I wouldn't. Angela and Catherine stared at my secretary, who had scolded them in a stern voice. I thanked Kathy for calming Angela and Catherine down. Catherine asked me, "Why are you wearing pantyhose?" I hemmed and hawed before I said it's not something I do regularly. I just felt that it was kind of cold outside, and I wanted an extra layer of clothing. That successfully convinced no one. I looked at their disbelieving faces with unease. Angela walked over to me and bent down. She moved my tattered pant leg away and examined my legs. She smiled and said they're shaved. I blushed in embarrassment. I tried to explain that's to make the pantyhose feel better on my legs. It's purely for comfort. Kathy almost laughed at my pathetic lies. I gave up the charade at that point. I said, girls, I'll be honest. I've cross-dressed before, just around the house. I only wear women's clothes beneath my male ones in public. I hope we can all be adult about this and put it behind us. Catherine then asked, why don't you dress up as a woman in public? I paused and said, I can't do that. It's not acceptable behavior. Why don't you just do it here then? Angela interjected. Girls, I'm not really capable of pulling it off, I replied. Kathy laughed and said, yes, you are. Look at your dainty little arms with baby fat where your muscles should be. You've got small hands and feet too, just like a woman. You're only 5'6". That's not very tall for a woman. A little more than average, but nothing more. You've already got long hair and thin eyebrows. I nodded as she listed the features that I loved about myself. I loved my feminine qualities and loved hearing about them. Angela chimed in and said, don't forget his legs. They're perfectly thin and toned. Kathy nodded and added, and you've got girlish features like your narrow nose and small head. I blushed as she described me. I laughed it off and said it doesn't matter. I can't bring myself to do it. I've tried before, but I can't. Nonsense, Kathy declared. You'll do it. I know you can. We know what you are now. Don't try to hide it. I felt a tear reach my eye as I realized that my humiliation was already complete with these girls. I was not a man in their eyes. I batted the tear away with blinks and said, you're right, Kathy. I'll do it. Kathy grinned broadly. Angela and Catherine looked at each other with smiles. I had nothing to lose with these girls. I was already a pantyhose-wearing, leg-shaving guy. A skirt and heels wouldn't make much difference in their estimation of me. I got the office back to working and went home that night. After dinner, I decided to lay out my outfit for the following day. I went into Rachel's bedroom to look at my female clothes. Rachel was my female alter ego. I had 4 bedrooms in my home. One was used as my study, one was used for storage, the other was my male bedroom, and the other was my female bedroom. My male bedroom was full of my male clothes and Spartan adorned. My female bedroom was just the opposite. In that room, I embraced all aspects of femininity. I had a pink bedspread over my floral sheets. I had paintings and pictures of pretty flowers and ballerinas on the walls. The white furniture was full of my tights, pantyhose, and bras. My closet was carefully organized by clothing type. My skirt suits and business blouses were on one end, while my dresses and bedroom wear were in the middle, and my casual skirts, dresses, and tops were on the other side. The top of the closet and floor of it were littered with shoes. It was mostly heels, but there were some flats, wedges, and pastel flip-flops in there. I selected a simple black skirt suit. I decided to wear a pair of sheer black pantyhose with them. I looked at my various shoes and selected a conservative pair of 2 3/4-inch black patent leather heels. The rounded toe helped minimize the size of my feet, which were only a size 9 anyway, but I didn't want to make them look any bigger. I figured the cushioned footbed would be good on my feet too. I went to bed that night excited about the next day. It was the first time I could remember being excited about going to the office. The next morning I showered and ate a quick breakfast before I headed into Rachel's room. I combed my hair down so that it was straight and manageable. I then sat on the bed and slowly rolled my pantyhose up my legs. I waited for my excitement to subside before I reached into them and tucked away my member. I put on the black pencil skirt of the suit next. I felt so girlish as I pulled up the back zipper and walked in the small measured steps my constricted legs were forced to take. I attached my breast forms with glue and helped secure them in place with a black bra. I put on a teal satin blouse and then finished off the ensemble with the black suit jacket. I then sat in front of the vanity and did my makeup. I applied a little lipstick, mascara, with a touch of rouge. I then placed my makeup in my black purse. I zipped my purse closed after I placed my male wallet into it. I walked over towards my closet, picked up my black pumps, and slipped them on. I then headed down the stairs and into my garage. I slumped down as I opened my garage door and pulled my sports car out of the garage. I was carefully trying to not be seen. I wanted to make sure that none of my neighbors saw me. I got down the street and felt more relaxed. The farther I got from my home, the more comfortable I became being Rachel. I felt at ease being her. By the time I reached my office, I pulled up in front of the building and exited without even thinking about how I was dressed. I unlocked the office, headed into my office, and got to work. I heard Kathy enter the office. She came into my office to check me out. She froze where she stood when she saw me. She was genuinely surprised with how I looked. Kathy shook her head and asked me to stand in front of her. I came out from behind my desk. She sized me up like a piece of meat. She said, "I wish I had your legs." I smiled at her compliment. She was a short woman of only 5'1". She was not fat, but her legs were thicker than mine. I asked her, "How do I look?" "Are you serious? You look lovely. I would never guess that you were a guy if I didn't know better. You look just like any other young professional woman." I smiled and thanked her. She said, "You're welcome, dear. You're a pretty average-looking girl. I wouldn't go entering any beauty pageants, but other than that, you're set." I blushed, smiled, and ignored the fact she called me dear instead of Mr. Tyler, which I guess would have been pretty ridiculous to call me at that moment. I heard the door open again and heard Angela and Catherine's voices. They usually came in together. I walked towards my office door to go out and greet them. As I did, I caught Kathy staring at my steps. She saw how femininely I walked. She noted it. I caught her and blushed. She knew I had real experience in heels. I came out and Angela and Catherine froze as they stood near their desks. Angela's mouth dropped. Catherine giggled a little and said, "You look like a girl." "Isn't that the point?" I asked. Catherine nodded and said, "You really look like a girl." I nodded and said thank you. Kathy put her arm on my shoulder and said, "She's a compliment, girls." We all laughed a little. Then I motioned the girls into the conference room so we could talk. I smelled the coffee in there that Kathy had put on while Catherine and Angela were first examining me. I had the girls sit while the sound of the coffee brewing filled the silent room. I looked down at the girls and said, "So what does everyone think?" Angela smiled and said, "You make a better girl than a guy." I blushed. I didn't know how to take that. Was that a compliment of my femininity or a condemnation of my masculinity? I knew my frame was more like a girl's than a man's, but I knew no one questioned my gender as a man, only my sexual orientation. Angela asked, "Do you have a name you call yourself? Miss Tyler?" I smirked as she called me Miss Tyler instead of Mr. Tyler like she always did. I responded, "I call myself Rachel." Catherine said, "Rachel, that's a nice name for you." "Thank you," I replied. Catherine continued, "Miss Tyler, you really walk like a girl." I shrugged and said, "I guess." "How long have you been walking in heels?" Kathy asked. I said, 8 years. Angela giggled and said, "That's longer than me." I blushed and said, "Well, that's not really important. You walk just as good as I do in them, and I could never pull off those pointy-toed slingbacks you like." Angela said, "Of course. What are they? Calvin Klein?" Angela nodded, smiled broadly, and turned to Catherine. Catherine giggled and asked me, "Where did you get those shoes?" "I ordered them online from Lord & Taylor. I love them. They're Steve Madden's." "You buy Steve Madden's?" Catherine asked. "Well, yes, I love his shoes." "I do too, especially the ones you've got on." "Thanks, they're one of my favorites. I've got some gray ones I like more, and some black suede ones with bows on them." Catherine looked at me with an amused look and asked, "How many pairs of heels do you have?" I counted once, and it was about 110. I saw 3 jaws drop. I had really given myself up. This wasn't something I did some of the time. My crossdressing was a regular occurrence, something I did whenever I could. Kathy had known me the longest. She smiled at what I had admitted and what I was wearing. She seemed to have confirmed everything she ever thought of me. I figured that she thought of me as a girl. Kathy then blurted out, "I want a cup of coffee." I saw that it was made and was already standing, so I instinctively walked over and poured her a cup and put in a little milk. I didn't think anything of it. She didn't ask me to do it. I just did it for reasons I don't even pretend to know. The looks I got as I brought it back to Kathy conveyed shock at what I had done. I began to realize that I had just fetched my employee coffee. I placed it in front of Kathy and tried to play it off, saying just felt like being one of the girls for a bit. Kathy smiled and nodded. She gave me a probing look, as did Angela and Catherine. They all had picked up on something about me. Catherine asked me, "Can you get me a cup of coffee too, if you're just being one of the girls?" I smiled and said, "Of course, Miss Smith." As I turned away, I almost could have hit myself for saying it. I had slipped into my secretary fantasy. I looked back at the girls as they examined me as I poured the coffee and added milk and sugar the way Catherine liked it. They all knew there was more to my cross-dressing than I was letting on. I brought the coffee to Catherine, who said, "Thank you, Rachel." She had addressed me by my first name. Well, not really my first name, just what I had told them I called myself. I smiled and failed to correct her. The girls picked up on it, and Kathy asked Rachel, "Why did you call Catherine Miss Smith?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know. I guess I was being proper." "Proper? How so?"
Kathy asked.
"I'm not sure. I didn't mean anything by it," Kathy said with mock indignation. "Oh, so you call me by my first name and not Catherine?" I knew I shouldn't like that tone from a subordinate, but it turned me on. I said, "I'm sorry. I'll be sure to stick to calling you all by your first names." Kathy replied, "Why not our last names?" "Because you're my employees. You call me by my last name, not the other way around." "Rachel, I don't think that's right," Catherine interjected. "Well, Miss Smith." I caught myself calling her that again. I was slipping into my secretary fantasy again. Angela piped up and said, "You did it again, Rachel." I shook my head and heard Kathy say, "Maybe you'd like to assist the girls around here for a little while." I shook my head and Kathy said, "Hear me out, Rachel. You could be the secretary, and I'll work your job for a week. I'll be just as capable as you in making sure the other two do their work. I'm sure you could do my job." "I can't do that, Miss Roberts," I replied while I was almost simultaneously damning myself for saying it. "There. You called me by my last name like a secretary would, not a boss. You want to do my job. Just admit it." I wanted to admit it, but I feared I'd lose their respect if I did. I shook my head and said, "I don't really." Angela smiled and said, "Rachel, can you get me that file behind you?" I turned and walked a few steps towards the counter and took the file off of it. I felt like a secretary as I picked it up and walked it over towards Angela. I handed it to her with a smile like a good secretary would. Angela said, "Thank you, Rachel." I replied, "You're welcome, Miss Tori." I realized I couldn't help myself. As long as I was dressed as a woman, I was going to be acting the role. I wanted to be a woman. I wasn't a female boss. I was a female secretary in my fantasies. My whole life I'd been playing out the role alone. Now that I was dressed as a girl at work, the fantasy role was taking over what I wanted to be. It was overtaking what I was supposed to be. Kathy then said, "You really want us to believe that you don't want to be a secretary even for a little bit?" I did not reply. I was silent and still. Kathy continued, "Rachel, we're not talking about forever here. Maybe a week tops. What do you have to lose? Do you think we'll really think less of you for acting like a secretary for a week? You're already in a skirt, for God's sake. We're not going to think you're less of a man for wanting to be a secretary too." Kathy took me down a few pegs with that one. I nodded and said, "I do want to be a secretary." She smiled and said, "Then, do we have a deal? For 1 week we'll swap jobs. Is that okay?" I nodded. Kathy reached out her outstretched hand and said, "Deal." I shook her hand and she stood up. She asked me to sit at the table. I did so next to Angela and Catherine. Kathy then laid down the rules. "Rachel, you're to call me by my last name like I used to call you." I nodded in acceptance of this. Kathy continued, "Unlike me, you're to call Miss Smith and Miss Tori by their last names as well. It will help secure your acceptance of your position." I nodded. I badly wanted to call them by their last names. I didn't need to accept my position, though. I was more than capable of playing the secretary after years of doing so in my head and at home for a fictional boss. Kathy noted my acceptance and said, "Good. Now girls, get to work." Catherine and Angela stood up and went to their desks while I followed Kathy to my office. I got her set up in there. I showed her where I kept everything. She then set me up at her desk. She showed me where everything was filed and what work had to be done. Everything she showed me filled me with excitement. I had long envied Kathy for being a secretary. I wanted to do it so badly. Now I was getting a chance to essentially be her. As I sat at her desk to fill out some forms, I saw her close the door to my office. It was a clear show of authority. It wasn't my office anymore. It was hers. I was just the secretary and would have to knock to be permitted to enter. It didn't take me long to get a call. I picked up the phone and said, as Kathy always did, Lawnmower Industries, how can I help you? The voice responded, this is Mr. McCardle calling for Catherine Smith. I'll transfer you right away, sir. I replied before transferring his call to Catherine. It felt good to field the call like a secretary. After I finished filling out the forms, I knocked on Kathy's door and said, Miss Roberts, can I come in? Yes, Rachel, she replied. I entered and handed her the forms. She smiled as she took them and said, I've got a few things for you to do, Rachel. I smiled and said, what are they, Miss Roberts? Well, I want you to order us lunch from Mario's. I'll be having eggplant rollatini. I want you to get the other girls' orders as well. You'll be picking it up. I nearly flipped out when she said I had to pick it up. I shook my head and said, Miss Roberts, I can't pick it up. They'll know what I am. She shook her head and said, first, they won't know. You're too effeminate for them to pick up on your hidden masculinity. Furthermore, you have no choice in the matter. I nodded in resignation. Kathy continued, I want you to set me up an appointment on the 14th for a mani-pedi at Scher's Nails in the afternoon. I also want you to copy these documents, she said as she handed them to me. I took them from her hand and she continued, but first go get me a cup of coffee. I nodded and took her cup as well. I placed the papers on my desk and headed for the conference room to pour her a cup of coffee. As I walked past Angela and Catherine asked, can you get me a cup, Rachel? I replied I would as I picked up her cup. Angela asked for one as well. I took their 3 cups into the conference room and poured each a cup. I put milk into all their cups and put sugar into Catherine and Angela. I almost had to laugh at myself then. I was their boss, but if anyone saw me then, they wouldn't possibly think that. I carried their coffees back to them. As I placed a cup on Catherine's desk, she said, thank you, Rachel. I replied, you're welcome, Miss Smith. I turned to Angela and handed her a cup. She smiled and thanked me. I smirked as I walked away to deliver a cup to Kathy. I walked in and gave her the cup. She took it from me and waved me off dismissively as she talked on the phone. I felt a surge of sexual bliss as I was dismissed like a secretary instead of being respected like a boss. I walked out of her office, picked up the papers, and brought them to the copier. I made the copies she asked like she had done for me 1,000 times before. I went over to Catherine and Angela and asked if they wanted anything from Mario's. Both of the girls gave me their orders. I called up and put in the order. I then called the shop for Kathy's mani-pedi. I heard the girl on the other end say, Scher's Nails, Anna speaking. How can I help you? Yes, I'd like to schedule a mani-pedi on the afternoon of the 14th. Okay, just let me check the book. Okay, we're good to go. Is 3 p.m. good? Yes. Thank you. That would be perfect. Okay, and who is the appointment for? Miss Kathy Roberts. Kathy Roberts? Yes, she's a regular here. Oh, she's never had anyone else call for her. Who are you? I blushed as I said for the first time. I'm her secretary. Secretary? Wow, she's really moving up in the world. About time. Okay, you tell Kathy to come in at 3 o'clock on the 14th. Thank you, and have a good day, I said before hanging up. I smiled as I hung up the phone, but then I looked up and saw Catherine standing before my desk. She dropped a file on my desk and asked, can you file this for me, Rachel? I smiled and said, of course I can, Miss Smith. I took the file, went over to the filing cabinet and put it away. I turned and saw Angela coming towards me. She handed me some documents she needed copied and asked if I could do it. I smiled and nodded. I sat at the copier, making her copies like a good secretary. I brought them to her, went back to my desk, and started doing some of Kathy's work. As lunchtime approached, I headed for the door. Kathy stopped me before I could get out the door and gave me a ticket and some money to reclaim her dry cleaning. I smiled and said I'd be happy to pick it up. Kathy rolled her eyes like I had no choice in the matter, and my happiness in doing so didn't matter. I smirked and headed for my car. I drove down to the dry cleaners and headed for the door with a little trepidation. These were going to be the first people seeing me en femme who did not know me. I gulped before I walked in. I smiled and said in a high, breathy voice, I'm here to pick up some dry cleaning. The woman took my ticket and nodded. She handed me 2 of Kathy's pantsuits. I paid the bill and headed out the door with a smile on my face. The old woman had not let on that she thought I was a man. That made my day. I then headed to Mario's with renewed confidence. I walked into Mario's with my chest out and my head up and looked around. The place was largely empty except for the staff. The girl working the counter looked at me and asked if I had an order. I told her I made an order under the name Rachel Tyler. Again, no one indicated that they thought I was a man. The girl nodded and got the 2 bags full of food. I paid the bill and was later reimbursed partially from Kathy, Angela, and Catherine. We all ate at our desks like usual, only now Kathy was ordering me to get her a soda out of the fridge. I dutifully went and got it for her. If I was going to be a secretary, I was going to be a good one. I opened it and knocked on Kathy's office door. Kathy let me enter. I moved towards her and put it on her desk. She smiled at me before I left her office and sat back at my secretary's desk to finish eating. Kathy came out after she was done eating and ordered me to get some files on her desk. I don't know why, but her orders turned me on. My manhood was searching in my pantyhose as I went through the filing drawers to search for the files Kathy requested. I brought them, and after I found them and placed them on her desk, she looked up as I brought them in and mumbled thanks. I smiled at the small amount of thanks she provided me. I felt more like a secretary than ever. I knew I loved it as much as I had fantasized I would. As my first day as a secretary ended, I felt better than I had in years. I was finally doing what I wanted to do. I went home and pulled into my garage quickly so no one would see me in my skirt suit. I made myself dinner and followed that up with a shower. I put on my pink satin slip after I dried myself off and sat on the couch. I watched TV for a bit before I turned in that night. After I ate the next morning, I showered and slipped on my black opaque tights. I dressed in a cream pleated skirt and a black 3/4 sleeve blouse. I brushed my hair and put on my lipstick, eyeliner, and blush. I put on my gray satin open-toed platform pumps. They were my favorite pair to look at because of the crisscross straps at the vamp and the 4-inch stiletto heel. They made me feel so feminine when I wore them. After I put them on, I picked up my black leather purse and headed into my garage. I drove to the office eagerly awaiting another day as a secretary. I was finally doing the one thing I always wanted to do, and it was making me happy. I couldn't imagine my life getting any better. I saw Kathy as I entered. She smiled at me. I smiled at her and asked, "How are you, Miss Roberts?" "I'm good, Rachel. How are you enjoying your new position?" "I love it. I can't believe I get to do it." Kathy smirked and said, "Well, maybe you should stay there a little longer." I nodded before I realized what she meant. I asked, "How much longer do you have in mind?" Kathy shrugged and said, "A few years." "Years?" I said with shock. "Yes, I think that's how long it will take you to get this out of your system." "I can't do that, Miss Roberts. The business needs its leader." "I can lead it, Rachel." "I know you can, but I need to make sure it's run profitably." "If that's your problem, let's draft up a clause then that lets you take the company back over if its profitability drops," I said before trailing off. I knew she had me where she wanted me. She wanted to be the boss. She was exploiting my weakness. She was using my desire to be a secretary for her own ends. She was positioning herself. She was going for the kill. I smiled and said, "Let's make a deal." She smiled and pointed to the conference room. We sat at the table and started hammering out the deal. We each had offers and counteroffers. We first settled on the length of the contract, which would be 2 years. She would run the company for 2 years, and I would be her personal secretary during that time. I would have the right to terminate her and resume my old position if the corporation's profitability declined by more than 10% from its current amount. I was terminated, or if I decided to sell the company. The last part was a sticking point. She did not want me to have that power because it gave me an out. I saw it as a protection against abuse. I eventually persuaded her that the out wasn't much protection because it would result in me losing my company and the position I wanted in it. We then limited Kathy's powers. She was prohibited from selling the corporation's assets. She could only spend the money the corporation made. Other than that, her position was invested with all the powers I had exercised. She had near despotic control over the company. As we finished haggling over the terms, She asked me to type up the contract. I went over to my desk and typed up the contract. I presented it to her when I was finished. She looked over the terms, and they met her approval. She signed the contract and pushed it over to me. I looked at it for a few minutes as I ran through what I was really doing. I was giving up control over my business for 2 years. For 2 years, I would be living out my fantasy whether I wanted to or not. With a hint of trepidation, I signed the paper. Kathy took it away from me and placed it in the safe in what was to be her office for 2 years. Kathy then stood up. We walked out of her office and towards Catherine and Angela to tell them what we had agreed to. They looked stunned as they heard Kathy's words. Angela looked at me with a look of fear in her eyes as she said, "You signed a contract putting Kathy in charge for 2 years?" I nodded. Angela leaned back in her chair. Catherine smiled at me and said, "Well, it'll be nice to have you as one of the girls around here, Rachel." Angela still looked concerned. Catherine's smile faded as soon as Kathy started to speak again. Catherine realized that we all wouldn't just be girls in the office. Kathy was clearly marking her territory to show her dominance. We all knew a serious change was coming. The minute Kathy said to them, "Girls, since my position as your supervisor is secure, you will all be calling me Miss Roberts from now on." The girls and I nodded in acceptance. Angela looked at Kathy with worry in her eyes. She later confided in me that she figured that she had just witnessed the trade of an easygoing boss for a taskmaster. To some extent, she was right. Kathy was far more demanding of Angela and Catherine than I was. They both became much more productive as Kathy laid into them in a way I was far too meek to do. Of course, their clerical work increasingly became mine after that until the increased profits they created funded the hiring of a secretary for them. After Maggie, the new secretary, came on board, I was simply Kathy's personal secretary. Other changes were more immediate for me. After my first week, I noticed my pay had been slashed down to what Kathy's had been. I went to her office to ask her about it. I knocked on the door and waited for permission to enter my former office. I cleared my throat and asked, "Miss Roberts, I noticed my pay has been cut. I would like to know why." Kathy looked at me with a peeved look in her eye. She said, "Rachel, have you looked at yourself lately? You're wearing a gray skirt suit, not a businessman's suit anymore. You're wearing 4-inch heeled pumps. You're a secretary now, not the boss. That's what secretaries make. You wanted to be one. I can't pay you what I pay Catherine or Angela. Deal with it. I get to set the salaries around here, and you make much more than minimum wage, so I wouldn't complain if I were you. Or I will cut your pay further, Rachel." I nodded submissively and said, "I'm sorry for wasting your time, Miss Roberts." I walked out of her office and back to my secretary's desk with a powerful erection in my tights. A certain sexual excitement came with each weekly check from that point on, as I dealt with that further reminder of my new position. I got secretary's pay while Kathy now made more than Catherine or Angela for the first time. The reduced salary was just part of my reduced status in life. I had usually paid out the company profits to myself in the form of a bonus, but Kathy decided to put an end to that. She reinvested the funds into the corporation to grow it. This was a dramatic change in my financial status. I no longer had the money to support my home. I had the money in the bank to easily pay for it for 2 years, but I saw no reason to spend down my savings to keep it. I put my house on the market and sold it for a substantial profit in a short period of time. I then rented an apartment I could afford on my secretary's salary. The apartment was about a 16th of the size of my former home. I had to put almost all of my male clothes in storage because I only had enough room for my female clothes in my closets. The loss of my masculine clothes resulted in me giving up being a man away from the office. I lived as a woman 24/7. I shopped as a woman. I sat around the apartment in women's clothing, and I slept in women's sleepwear. I grew my nails out and maintained a French manicure. I loved the way they looked. They kept me from even being tempted to go out and buy men's clothing. Going out as a male, without the effort it would require to eliminate the female look my hands now possessed, was impossible. My apartment was decorated with a woman's touch too, according to my neighbor when she came in and told me a single male lived there before me. She remarked at how dingy they make things look. I shared a laugh with her, knowing that I had always decorated my homes like a woman. I wasn't like a regular man. I was a skirted one. I was a man really in touch with his femininity. It was perhaps my only side. Only my biology makes me a man, I suppose. I liked the flowery print on my bedspread. I thought it looked pretty. I liked my pink bedroom walls and rug with white molding around the windows, doors, floor, and ceiling. I knew it was girlish, but that was the point. I wanted to drive home to myself for those 2 years that I was a girl, not the man I was accidentally born as some cruel joke. My other apartment rooms were painted in pastel colors with pretty paintings on the walls of nature scenes. It all helped me feel like the working woman I was sure I was supposed to be born as. Next, I decided to sell my sports car. I loved that car, but I had bought it to impress women. Seeing as I was now wearing a skirt for 2 years, impressing women seemed like a lost cause. Not too many women go running after a guy wearing tights, heels, and a skirt suit. Men in lipstick don't turn girls on unless they're goths. Keeping the car would be a waste. The only person trying to get with me at that point was my neighbor Carl. I thought his attempts at wooing me were cute, but I have no sexual attraction to guys. Still, I had to struggle to make it clear I had no interest in him. After I initially flirted with him despite my disgust at the thought of being with him, he just wouldn't take no for an answer. One day Carl came to me in the lobby and asked Rachel,